Hi again, everyone. In this video, I'll be going over the therapeutic process according to narrative therapy. If you haven't already watched the philosophy and basic assumptions of narrative therapy, that would give you a good foundation from which to start this. So I recommend you go back there and then come back here. All right, so let's begin with assessment. So in narrative therapy, remember that we're taking a non-pathologizing approach. So narrative therapists avoid diagnosing or labeling clients. Instead, the assessment involves listening to the problem-saturated story of the client and identifying problematic dominant stories. And there are questions that you can ask in order to find out what that story looks like. The role of the therapist in this case is to be a collaborative, active listener. So the therapist is there to listen without judgment, without blame, and to adopt a not knowing position that allows you to follow, affirm, and be guided by the stories of the client as a participant observer. This helps the client to see that they are the experts regarding their lives, which they are. We would then ask questions in order to elicit client resources and to find out more information about their problem-saturated story. Our function, first, therapists help clients to search for times in their lives when they were resourceful through the use of skillful questioning. Therapists also assist clients in mapping the influence that a problem has had on their lives. So what are the areas of their lives that have been affected by the problem? We assist clients in separating themselves from the dominant stories that they have internalized. Remember, the problem is the problem. And we guide the client in creating alternative life stories. Basically, this involves a lot of questions, and we'll get into some of those in the therapeutic techniques section. Now, the conceptualization. So remember that judgments placed upon us by other people, especially those that have influence over us, have been internalized and integrated into our dominant story. These stories are negatively influencing our thoughts and, in turn, decision-making and behavior when they are problem-saturated. Evidence against these thin descriptions, such as accomplishing things and so on, are then ignored or minimized. So people have fused with their problems and see themselves as the problem because they have internalized all of these negative descriptions of themselves. Accordingly, they lose sight of their dreams, their values, and their goals, and who they are separate from the problem. This can also cause them to forget or to be unable to see their abilities and their resources, which is why we see them the way that we do in therapy. If we had to summarize this in a sentence or two, basically we are seeing symptoms because the client has become fused with their problem. They've internalized negative judgments about themselves, and this is resulting in negative decision-making and behavior. So what are the goals of therapy? First off, and this one's probably obvious, we want to separate the individual from their problems. We want to externalize the problem. We also want to modify painful beliefs, values, and interpretations that the client may have about themselves because of those thin descriptions. We want to create meaning and new possibilities from the stories that they share by developing alternative stories that include new options or new strategies for living. Now, some interventions. We'll start with deconstruction. Deconstruction involves breaking down the problem into smaller and more specific core issues that are easier to understand and address. And this can be done, again, through skillful questioning and through mapping assignments, where we try to figure out the different areas and ways in which the problem has affected the client's life. Externalization involves leading the client toward viewing their problems or behaviors as external instead of an unchangeable part of themselves. There's a really powerful difference between the mindset of someone who labels themselves as a problem versus someone who engages in problematic behavior. So we want to move toward that perception of being someone who engages in problematic behavior as opposed to being the problem yourself. This is done by developing a shared definition of the problem, mapping its effects, evaluating its effects, and then justifying the evaluation. This process facilitates hope, reduces self-blame, and allows for the creation of a more positive healing story. Some strategies for this. So this can be done by talk therapy, through questions again, as well as through expressive art. So things like journaling about a specific set of questions, like how does this problem affect you? How did the problem take hold of your life? And so on. You can use drawing or painting, where you illustrate the effects of the problem in that way, maybe creating a symbolic drawing. And it can be done by movement. So instructions might be, begin by moving your usual way, then allow the problem to influence your movement. Then develop a transitional movement that begins to shake the problem's hold on you, and then transition into a liberation movement that metaphorically and physically allows you to separate from the problem. So those would be some expressive art techniques. And here they are. Okay, unique outcomes. So in this case, we are viewing your own storylines and focusing on the storylines that didn't include or that don't include your most pervasive problems. So these can be thought of as moments of success or exceptions to the rule. And these unique outcomes can be found in the past, present, or hypothesized for the future. So what are some moments in the past when you were successful against your problem, for example, or how do you see yourself as being successful in the future? This helps clients to see that change is possible, but it requires that the therapist pay very close attention to the client's story in order to help them identify these moments in the past. It also requires that the therapist use guiding questions to help elicit evidence of these unique outcomes. InteGratedFamilyTherapy.com provides some really great guiding questions to facilitate this process. And so that's where these are. There are different categories. Enabling openings, some questions would be, can you describe the last time you managed to get free of the problem for a couple of minutes? What was the first thing you noticed in those minutes? What was the next thing? And so on. Linking openings with preferred experience. So a question like, would you like more moments like these in your life? Exploring landscapes of action. How did you achieve that? How did so-and-so help you with that? Living with exceptions of the past. Tell me about times when you've managed to achieve a similar few minutes in the past. And then linking exceptions of the past with the present. When you think about those times in the past, when you have achieved this, how might this alter your view of the problem now? Okay. And there are a lot more examples at that website. All right, another intervention is reauthoring, which is also called restorying. And this involves actively exploring experiences and finding alterations to make to one story, or making a whole new one by changing interpretations and meaning. So this includes helping the client include neglected parts of themselves that might make their story more accurately reflect who they are. It also involves shifting that problem-centered or problem-saturated narrative. One activity that is helpful with this is My Life Story, which is from positivepsychology.com. And we're going to be doing this one as our in-class activity, so I'm not going to go into more detail on that one here. Documenting evidence is another intervention and can be done through therapeutic letter writing. When we're documenting evidence, we're basically supporting the creation and acceptance of new stories by being an audience or by providing an audience to appreciate and support them. Okay? So one technique for doing this is writing letters to a person, and the letters that a therapist writes basically provide a record of the session and may include an externalizing description of the problem and its influence on the client, as well as a description of the client's strengths and the abilities that were identified in the session. This letter can then be read by the client at different times when they're needing it, and it can include direct quotes from the client, basically anything that's necessary to help the client feel more evidence for the change in their story, or to help make that story stick, if you will. Okay, so now evaluating this approach. So some limitations. Narrative therapists really need to be careful not to bring in their own beliefs and attitudes that might influence the client. Narrative therapy could also use more empirical research to provide evidence of its efficacy. This is challenging though because of the nature of the therapy. It's not manualized, it's client-led, so that's a challenge. And then the not knowing stance may make the client feel that the therapist doesn't know what they're doing, or it might give them less confidence in the therapist. So you need to be sure to emphasize your competencies in the process of therapy, but how that is different from the client's expertise in their own life. Strengths, The emphasis on multiple realities and accepting that everybody interprets their experiences differently and that interpretation is real is helpful and is sensitive to diversity, so valuing and validating a client's experience. It also provides clients with a framework for thinking about how their stories impact what they do and influence their behavior. It allows for the reinterpretation of significant life events in a way that emphasizes strength and resiliency as opposed to pathology and victimization. And it allows guidance in a manner that is respectful of underlying values. Those are some strengths. All right, that is it for narrative therapy. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.